Hey, what's going on, everybody? So it's been a hot minute since I've put out a video. I've been in the process of moving and I started a new job and there's just been a lot of stuff going on. So I've been a little bit busy and have not had my setup to actually record videos in probably about 6 months. But now I've kind of got my setup back to where I can actually do this again. Hopefully it won't be so long before my next one comes out, but we'll just have to see. Also, thank you to everybody who subscribed. It's been awesome. I didn't think I was going to get over 1,000 subscribers, and here I am with so thank you to everybody who watches these videos and have subscribed to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about optimal Unifi wireless settings. So this is kind of something that's come up a few times in the comments, and also something that I've been dealing with at work. And there's also some tweaking and optimization that you can do to, this is not that. I will kind of point out some settings that would help with that, but the goal of this video is basically compatibility and reliability. And this is kind of just a bunch of stuff that I have found in the real world that has helped, and also some very basic wireless theory. So first off, let's pull up our Unifi controller. Now I'm actually going to be using the demo Unifi controller. And if you don't know what that is, just go to Google and type in Unifi demo. So Ubiquiti actually has its own demo of the Unifi controller online that you can play around with and see all the various settings. This is just a demonstration of the software. So there's a bunch of fake devices. You can change settings. You can go through the menus. You can do pretty much anything that you want and not affect anything at all. So we're just going to use this to see the settings. Now, I'm assuming that you've watched my video on how to set up the Unifi controller. So we're kind of just going to pick up there and dig into the settings that I did not mention in that video. So first off, let's go over how you lay out a network. And for this, I'm going to pull up our whiteboard and just kind of draw a quick outline of possibly a house or an office or something. All right, so say this is your, we'll say house, and you've got like your kitchen kind of in this area over here, your dining room, living room, main area, and then like bedrooms, bathrooms. You know, make up your own design and what these rooms actually are. Doesn't really matter. But the key to having a good wireless setup is in the planning for it and where you're putting your wireless access points. And this is going to change depending on a whole lot of different factors. I'm not going to get real deep into it, but you know, construction materials, your wireless signal is going to go through regular drywall a lot better than it is and like a exterior stone wall. Your mileage may vary on a lot of these because all houses are made out of different materials, and different materials interact with Wi-Fi radio signals in a different way. And also each house has its own interference that can be introduced as well from other devices. But just as a general rule, you want to set your channels at a minimum to not overlap. And this is what I mean by that. So say you want full coverage on your house. Say you've got an access point in the kitchen, the living room, and at the end of the hall. And we're going to use green as kind of the like signal areas of these access points. I'll go ahead and label them 1, 2, and 3. So you can see that between 1, 2, and 3, there's some overlap where you're on the radio or you're talking to an access point while you can still see the range of the other access point. So you want to lay out your channels in a way that don't overlap. And those non-overlapping channels for a 2.4 gigahertz band, which is like your wireless BGN devices. 2.4 gigahertz has a lot bigger range. It can go through a lot more materials, and you'll get, you can use it further away than you can, say, 5 gigahertz or wireless AC. There's a trade-off between 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. 5 gigahertz is faster. There's more bandwidth there, but it cannot penetrate walls as good as 2.4. So 2.4 has the highest chance of overlap. It's also the most used band for wireless everywhere. And it also has the fewest non-overlapping channels. So if you're doing a 2.4 gigahertz wireless network, your channels to look out for are 1, 6, and 11. These are the non-overlapping channels. So if you're laying out your house and you have these 3 access points, you're going to want to make one of them on channel 1, one on channel 6, and another on channel 11. And this is where you get that non-overlapping those non-overlapping channels. There we go. I can't talk today. Now, on the other hand, for 5 gigahertz, you have a few more options, but here you will run into something, especially with Unifi, called a DFS channel. Now, I haven't read too much into these DFS channels. However, from my understanding is they're a part of the spectrum that's used for like radar. And if you're in an area that really doesn't have any radar around, you're clear to use those channels. And because they're DFS channels, there's going to be less devices around that's probably going to use them. But if you are in an area that has radar or something that would use that, then I want to say that your signal can drop on those channels if a radar goes active. Don't really quote me on that, but my general rule of thumb is to not use DFS channels. So when you are selecting your 5 gigahertz band, I just ignore that those channels even exist. All right, so for 5 gigahertz, you have a lot more options here. So ignoring those DFS channels, you are left with channels 36, 40, 44, 48, 149, 153, 157, and 161. This middle section here is where those DFS channels are, which I just ignore. You can use them, but I opt not to. So if we're planning our 5 gigahertz deployment, we're going to put these as far apart as possible. So I would usually do something like use channel 36 for access point 1, 161 for access point 2, and something like probably 48 for access point 3. This way they are sufficiently spread out. Now there is another kind of discussion, and that is the channel width. There is 20 megahertz, 40, and 80 megahertz channel widths. Now what this is basically the higher the channel width, the higher the throughput. So when you see insanely high throughput rates advertised by an access point, that's usually with a very wide channel. Now, the downside to using wider channels is that you use more airtime, there's more interference, and there's more noise in the wireless signals. And also, only newer devices or devices that are compatible with these wider channel widths will be allowed to talk. So, for the purpose of this video, for reliability, I always use 20 megahertz channel widths. With 5 gigahertz, it's a little safer now to use 40 megahertz, but this does impact your channel selection as well, because each one of these are 20 megahertz channels. You move up to 40 megahertz, now it's using double. So instead of using 36 and 40 as non-overlapping channels, you would have to use 36 and 44, because if you're using a 40 megahertz channel width, then 36 and 40 are going to be overlapping. And the same thing with 80. If you're using 80, then you really only get to use either channel 36 and 149 or like 48 and 161. So you cut down the amount of channels, non-overlapping channels that you can use when you have higher channel widths. But that's the trade-off. For those of you that are looking for higher performance, the higher channel width is going to get you more throughput. But for those looking for reliability, the lower width channels are going to give you more compatibility and more stability, because there's not as much noise and there's not as much overlap in those. All right, so that is the bare basics of kind of a wireless layout. I will throw one more thing in here, because this kind of happens to me a lot. Say you want to add another access point like outside. 2.4 gigahertz, you don't want those overlapping channels, right? And there's only 3 of them. So if you have 4 access points, something's got to give here. You still don't want it to overlap, but you don't have any new channels that you can use unless you're not in the US. Technically, for 2.4 gigahertz, there is in certain parts of the world 4 channels that do not overlap, but we do not have that in the United States. So we're only concerned with 1, 6, and 11. So what are we going to do with this access point number 4, which is going to probably be overlapping with access points 1 and 2? Well, my general rule is I'll make it the same channel as whatever access point is the furthest away from it, or the one that has the least amount of likelihood of interfering. So as you can see, it looks like access point 4 is further away, or the furthest away from access point 3. So I would probably put access point 4 on channel 11 as well, just so that even if there is a little bit of overlap, it is the least amount of overlap from the other devices in the house. As far as the 5 gigahertz channel goes, I would say probably using channel 48 or 149 would be fine. since we put both of these access points 1 and 2 on very far apart channels. It will, again, the channel width will kind of determine here if both access points 1 and 2 are on an 80 megahertz channel. There's really no overlapping option unless we go into the DFS area, which, as I already said, I tend to avoid those. Also, I do not recommend 80 megahertz channels at all, just because that's kind of on the high end of that area. 40 megahertz is kind of like a do it if you want, but it could cause problems, and 20 megahertz is your safe bet. But like I've already said, your throughput is lower with a 20 megahertz channel, but it's more stable. So now that we've kind of talked about the theory and you're good and bored, let's go ahead and dive into the Unifi controller and some of the very basic settings that you're going to want to either make sure are enabled or disabled. And these settings mainly revolve around devices dropping off the network or if there's a Wi-Fi problem or stability issues. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to settings in your Unifi controller. Go ahead and close that access point that I had open for some reason. And you're going to go to the site. So this is your kind of main site configuration. And this is in the demo Unifi controller. So there's a whole bunch of stuff already plugged in. But the main thing you're going to want to look for here is the uplink connectivity monitor or wireless uplink. And some of these configurations that I'm going to throw out have either moved or they don't exist anymore. But here, this one does exist. So uplink connectivity monitor, enable connectivity monitor, and wireless uplink. Now, if you're not going to be using wireless uplink, disable this, because by default, it's going to be constantly pinging for other devices to see if there's a wireless uplink that should be formed or not. So it's not needed if the feature's not going to be used, or that's just extra airtime that it's taking up to look for a wireless uplink that you may or may not ever use. Now, obviously, if you are going to use a wireless uplink, which I have another video on that, you'll want to keep that enabled. But if you're not, save that airtime. Now, another feature is this enable advanced features. Now, I do believe in some versions of the Unifi controller, this was on by default. You want to make sure that this is disabled. And you can see in this demo one, it says that enabling it can cause intermittent connectivity. This is something you don't want on. Basically, what this enables is a bunch of features such as like airtime fairness, band steering, minimum RSSI, load balancing, and among other things. But most of these can cause issues, especially with older devices. And I believe some of them are even in the beta kind of testing phase. So we just leave that disabled. We don't need to worry about that. Now we're also going to make sure that automatic upgrades is unchecked. So automatically upgrade AP firmware. I don't know if this is checked by default in any version, but just make sure that's off. Some new firmwares can introduce problems. Most of the time, you don't want to be a part of the early adopters for the new firmware, just in case there is an issue. I'm a big believer in if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but you do want to keep your devices up to date. However, you don't want to get caught up in one of those firmware updates that hasn't been thoroughly tested and has introduced new issues. So update your devices when necessary, and I would manually update them just to be on the safe side. Now, another one is auto optimize network, and that is down here. So automatically optimize network and Wi-Fi performance. We want to keep that off. And the settings that this really controls is what's called high performance clients to 5 gigahertz only for all networks, blocking multicast and broadcast traffic, overriding any manual setting for either of those settings if you did check them, which I'll show you here in just a second where those settings are actually located. I do believe that this is no longer in beta, but it used to be. Depends on what version of the controller you have. And I can't recall if this is ever checked by default. But you want to make sure that it's off, because a lot of the features that it would enable, you can enable on your own, and I actually don't recommend you enable those features anyway. And speaking of those settings, under your wireless networks area, so whatever network you have configured, we're going to go to this first one, edit. Those settings are this fast roaming, which says beta. Make sure that this is unchecked. And this will tell you what it'll do. Enabling fast roaming allows certain devices with 802.11r capability to potentially roam faster, but then it gives you a warning that older devices may experience connectivity issues from lack of 802.11r client-side support. So this is something that for compatibility's sake, we're going to leave off. Now, if this is a very small home network and you can confirm that all your devices have 802.11r capability, this is something that could potentially make your network perform better. But overall, compatibility is not all there. So I recommend leaving it off. Another one to look out for is this multicast and broadcast filtering. Block LAN to wireless LAN multicast and broadcast data. Now you can enable this. Basically, if this is enabled, one wireless client cannot directly talk to another wireless client. This is especially important if you have wireless printers, because if this is enabled, you're not going to be able to broadcast to that printer. So leave that unchecked for compatibility's sake, unless you really know what you're doing and have a good use for it. Now, the last one that I'm concerned about here is high performance devices, which I just mentioned a second ago as being a part of that auto optimized network setting. Make sure that this is disconnected. I've seen this cause the most issues, I think, out of any setting, really. I'm not entirely, well, I do know what it does. It should say what it does too. Maybe not. Anyways, this will kind of automatically recognize what devices are 5 gigahertz capable and only connect them to the 5 gigahertz network. Now, where this causes issues is when you roam outside of the 5 gigahertz area of coverage. So typically you would roam from the 5 gigahertz band to the 2.4 gigahertz band when you get a little too far away from the access point, because like we said earlier, 2.4 goes further than 5 gigahertz and goes through more objects. So if this setting is checked, then when you get outside of that 5 gigahertz area, then you're just gonna drop. You're not gonna have internet connectivity, because this is saying that you're on a high performance device and you should only be on 5 gigahertz. And if your 5 gigahertz coverage area is not completely 100% laid out where you have signal everywhere, then it's gonna cause some issues. And that is in beta. I don't really recommend enabling any beta settings. Now, the last two settings that I'm going to talk about are kind of use at your own risk. Really, I don't touch these settings. Well, all right, that's a lie. I do one of them quite frequently, but there's something called DTIM mode and DTIM 2G and 5G period that you can modify. And I'm not really going to get into exactly what that is or what it means, because honestly, I don't really understand it that much. I just know that there is a little bit more optimal of a setting that you can use for it. And I'll kind of explain a little bit about that. But really, I don't venture too far into these settings unless there are a lot of reports of wireless issues. And also, I don't get into these until I've gone through all the other settings that I talked about. So if somebody says that there's a Wi-Fi issue, or if I'm trying to troubleshoot my own Wi-Fi issue, I'm going to look and make sure that all my APs are on the proper channels, that there are no overlapping channels if possible, that there's not an AP that's offline or something, and that all of those settings that we just talked about are disabled. However, if you've done all that and there's still some issues, then you might want to take a look at these. And the first one I'm going to talk about is called rate control. And this is the one that I do use sometimes. And that is under the wireless network where we're at. And there should be a section down here called 802.11 rate and beacon controls. And you can see we have used default values for the DTIM, which I will talk about here in just a second. That is not the actual rate control. Those are different timers. These sections down here, 2G data rate control and 5G data rate control, are what I'm talking about. Now, what this does is it makes sure that certain clients can talk at a set amount of speed, and if they can't maintain that speed, then they are dropped from the network. So you have this nice little slider here for your 2.4 gig network and your 5 gig network, and you can kind of slide it here. So here it's 1 megabit per second. Anything slower than 1 megabit per second is going to get dropped off the network, and you can move that over. You can say 12 megabits per second. Anything that cannot maintain that speed will be dropped from the access point. And you can see it gives you some warnings: limited range and no connectivity for 802.11b devices. So if you're using anything with 802.11b, which doesn't get up to 12 megabits anyway at full speed, they're just not going to work. So you'll want to lower it. And then it'll say limited range and connectivity for 802.11b devices. So since 802.11b has a maximum throughput of 11 megabits, you have to be pretty much right on top of the access point if you're going to set this to 9 megabits if you have an 802.11b device. Now, luckily, those are few and far between nowadays, but like I said, for compatibility's sake, you want this fairly low. But if you know you have a lot of high performance clients or newer devices, you might want to set this pretty high. Typically, what I'll set it at is 6 is kind of my rule of thumb if I am going to use rate control. Now let's go back to our little board here. What this really does is, say you've got a device and it's right here, just for example. What it's going to do is it's going to be talking to whatever access point it's paired with, and it's going to be seeing how fast it can transmit. Now, the further away a device is and the slower it can transmit, the more airtime it's going to take, basically. And the more airtime one device is taking is less airtime that other devices can use. So what you don't want is some very low signal device on an access point hogging all the airtime from other clients that are actually close to the access point. So it's really best to enable rate control to kind of kick them off when they get too far away. And also, this is kind of a double-edged sword. You can use this to enable better roaming between your access points. Because if you do have a well laid out network like we have here, this device is actually closer to access point 2. However, if it hasn't crossed over that speed threshold from access point 1, it's still going to be communicating with access point 1, which is not the most optimal access point. So say you up that that minimum rate and say he can only get that 6 meg rate if he's closer than this. So once that device is over here, it's going to disconnect from access point 1 and connect to access point 2, as long as it's able to maintain that speed to access point 2. So that's kind of what that rate control is. And it's the same story for 5 gigahertz as well. You can do it for both 2.4 and 5. Again, the same warnings apply. A lot of times if I'm doing this, I'm either going to use 9 or 12 for 5 gigahertz, if I do anything at all. A lot of times 6 megabits is good enough for the 5 gig channel. But like I said, unless you have a strong desire to use that, or you're having a lot of issues, leaving it off is just fine. Just remember kind of what I explained is happening. Some devices can stick to access points and clog up the airtime a little more than if you had those enabled. All right, now the next one is these DTIM settings. If we uncheck use default, the only time I touch these and the only setting I use is 3 and 3. And I only do this if there are issues, because this is the one that I really don't understand that much in what it does. I just know that 3 is kind of a more optimal setting sometimes. But from what I've read, you don't want to do this if it's a high density network, like say 50 plus or more devices per access point, which in your home, that's not going to matter. But you really don't want to play with this too much in a very large network or one that is very dense, because it can cause issues. And at that point, the defaults are probably better anyways. This does require a pretty well laid out network in order for it to really function as it should. So like I said, don't touch this if you haven't been through all the other settings that I've talked about previously. So we'll just go ahead and use default values, which is 1 and 1. Now, the last setting I'm going to talk about, which I don't think I've ever actually done. I don't even see it in here anymore. Actually, I think it's under rate control. Yeah, for the 2.4 gigahertz network, this disable CCK rates. So automatically when you enable that, you have limited and no connectivity for 802.11b devices. And basically 802.11b devices are all these CCK rates are used for. They're called complementary code keying rates. And when you disable them, you are disabling rates 1, 2, 5.5, and 11 megabits per second, which are pretty much all associated with 802.11b devices. Now, it still will allow a rate of 6 and 9 megabits, even though CCK rates are disabled, just because those rates aren't CCK. So I do believe 802.11b devices can connect, but only at those two speeds. I haven't tested this because 802.11b devices are old and I just don't have them around, and they don't really get used very much anymore. But basically, you'll only enable this if you are having a big problem with clients being what I call sticky. And that is hanging on to one access point for far too long when there is certainly a better option to roam to. It's almost the same, well, and it is definitely related because it's under this rate control, but basically it's just another level of rate control. I've never actually had to enable it because this slider basically does the work anyway, especially if you have this over 11 megabits. But if you do have some older devices or a big problem with devices not roaming properly or sticking to one access point for far too long, you can disable this. However, I've never actually gotten that far. I've fixed it with one of the other settings that we've talked about so far. And that is really all I have in this video. Again, this was kind of meant for when you already have your network set up and want to kind of have the optimal settings. These are just settings that I've found both by research and by just using in the field that can help the network be a little more optimal and a little more compatible with devices. Especially in a business setting, if you have guest networks, you have all kinds of devices. Internet of Things devices actually are a big one that these settings will help with, because a lot of them have lower quality network interface cards in them. So if you're using high performance settings like those wide channel ranges or anything like that, the high performance devices at 5 gigahertz only, a lot of times Internet of Things devices will drop from the network or have sporadic issues, intermittent connectivity, stuff like that. I will show you one more thing if you are a little lost on the channels, because I know I went over that first. Make sure your access points are on non-overlapping channels and it's laid out very well. Those settings are located on the access points themselves, and that's under the config section here, and radios. And this is where you can set those settings. So for your 2.4 gigahertz band, which is 802.11n, B, and G, here you have your channel width. You either have 20 megahertz channel width or 40. I always go with the lower one, as I've already said. And here's where you select your channel. Now you do have all channels open or auto. Auto, if there's not a whole lot of wireless networks in your area, it can do a halfway decent job of just doing it by itself. However, generally you want to hard code your channels because you know what your wireless landscape looks like, you know where your access points are, and a lot of times auto gets confused. Just be sure not to put it to 2, 3, 4, 5 or 7, 8, 9, 10. Technically you can, but as the general rule, non-overlapping channels are 1, 6, and 11. So we can change that to like 1. Transmit power is another one that you can play with if you want. This is especially useful if you have multiple access points that are very close to each other. This auto usually does a pretty good job. I don't really mess with the transmit power too often. I can tell you that you don't want to just put it to high. A lot of people will see high transmit power. Okay, well then that means the signal will go further. Yes, but I don't know if I've mentioned this in other videos, but especially with the long range access points like the APAC LR, they can shoot a signal way further than the client can reach back to it. And what I mean by that is your long range access point can shoot the signal really far, and your iPhone or whatever you have can pick that up, but the reply back to the access point, because your iPhone doesn't have that strong of a radio in it, it's still not going to work, and it's going to cause some issues because your phone is going to see that there's an access point that it can connect to, but its replies back to that access point won't reach it because there's a difference in radio power. So really you don't want this set too high, or else you'll have something like that happening where your phone says it's connected to an access point, but it's barely, if at all, working. If you have wireless access points that are very close together, low is probably a good option if you want to set a manual configuration here. And the antenna gain I never mess with. Here's those settings for wireless uplinks. Watch my wireless uplink video for more info on those. And also you have the same settings for 5 gigahertz. So you have 20, 40, and 80 as the channel width. Like I said, I usually will keep it at 20 just for compatibility's sake. 40 really is not a bad option anymore. Just your mileage may vary there. And again, channels here from 52 to 144, those DFS channels that I mentioned. You can use these if you want. I just choose to avoid them just because there are, I do believe it's radar that uses these also and can kick your devices off if something, I don't know. I haven't read that far into them, so I just avoid them altogether. I really don't have a need for them. My networks aren't that dense where I need more than the 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz channels here. Even with the 40 megahertz channel width, I can use 36, 44, 149, and 157. So that's 4 channels there. And by the time I've got 4 access points, none of those are going to be overlapping anymore. But okay, hopefully this video made sense. Hopefully I can get back into making more videos more often. Again, thank you to all of you who have subscribed, and happy networking.